Hi, welcome to a Leader's Journey podcast. This is Joel Gunn. I'm your host. Today I've got Brent Fessler as our co-host. Welcome, Brent.
Thanks, Joel.
And our guest is Dr. Brad Hobbs.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's great to hang out with you guys.
Yeah. Well, you and I hardly know each other, but you and Brent, I think, have known each other well. How do y'all know each other?
Well, we're a paradox, actually.
A pair of docs. That's
yes.
true.
Yeah, I was about to say, where are we going? Because I just thought Brent looked like a really smart guy, and I'm not that smart, so I just try to hang out with smart people and just get it by osmosis. And so I thought he was saying some really smart things, and I tried to emulate it, copy it when he walked out of the room.
And you ended up with a doctorate.
And I ended up with a doctorate. It's one of those pieces of paper that sits underneath my bed.
Nice. What's your doctorate in?
So it's in organizational leadership. And studied faith-based organizations and change management as a part of that.
And when you and I talked briefly before the show, 5,000 companies you interviewed or were involved in the process?
We surveyed 5,000 faith-based entities across the U.S. And really looked at which ones had an exponential impact, both in their finances, their actual kingdom impact, and then from their culture as an organization.
Two questions along that line. What was the find that you weren't really surprised, but it was resoundingly convincing? And then I'll ask another one.
Well, I had come across statistics and just prepping for the research that 70 to 80% of visions fail. And so when you start thinking about all of these great ideas, and the vast majority of them fail, and I just thought that there's no way that is true. So out of these 5,000 organizations, we found that 17 of them had actually set out a very written vision, strategic plan, and had achieved that plan within a 5 years' time.
Were there any ahas in the process? Any really caught you off guard?
Catching off guard is the type of leader leading those organizations through change management. Every single one of them that succeeded carried some significant battle wounds that they identified as spiritual wounds. And so regardless of what organization they were leading, most of the time they carried that wound and their family carried that wound of just what it took. Because most of them would model a heroic style of leadership from a classic leadership model where they put the organization on their back and would give their life to get to the success of the vision.
So that was in the ones that succeeded. They had that heroic style of leadership.
Yeah.
And in the faith-based organizations, does that mean they were all nonprofit ministry or some for-profit in there too?
So the vast majority of these were nonprofit organizations. And so they did bend. There were a few for-profit. In fact, two of the successful ones were for-profit entities. But the vast majority of them were nonprofits.
Okay.
Did you ever look at the data to say, for the nonprofits, it was 0.01% succeeded, but the for-profits, since that was a smaller pool, did that happen to be a much higher percentage, or still?
I would have to go back and look at it to really pull that out. After about 4 years of spending the data, I was just trying to get the paper in for somebody to sign off on it, and so I had done enough research and enough data. I do believe that I had to do 17 rounds of edits on my prospectus, and so by the time we got to my dissertation, I just wanted it to be done.
Sure.
So, it's also something like a 0.1% success rate of PhD students actually being able to finish the dissertation.
Finish it.
Yeah.
And so I had when I was 14, I wrote down a goal that I wanted to have my PhD before I was 30. And so I walked across the stage with 8 days to spare in that goal. And so I was doing whatever I could to get across that stage before turning 30.
That's fascinating. So at 14, you were writing goals down? Or did you go to some weird youth camp or something?
I did. I did. That's exactly what happened. My parents, I grew up in small town, South Georgia, town right now probably about 30,000 people. If you look at the top 10 worst cities to live in from the past decade, my hometown is always in one of the top 10. And so, but we had a great church and pastor who believed in leadership development. And so he convinced my parents and about 10 other families to send us to a leadership program that was based in Orlando and Washington, D.C. and London and Paris. And part of that was, well, what are you going to do with your life? You don't write down what God's called you and created you to do. The chances of you doing that are slim. And so we did some goal setting and time management. And so I wrote down 3 goals, and that really dictated the first 16 years of my leadership journey, I would say.
That's cool.
Okay, so do you keep up with the rest of that cohort?
I do.
Yeah.
In fact, for the past 15 years, I actually go back and teach in the program.
Uh-huh.
And so I had the opportunity to go to London and Normandy and talk to U.S. high school students about what it means to lead from a global perspective, taking a biblical and historical look at leadership. And so I get to do that with a few people from that cohort.
So those other 10 kids that were with you, do you feel like they've succeeded at a greater rate? Oh, we've heard people say, yeah, when you set goals at a young age, you're X times more likely to achieve those things.
So the handful that I'm still really close with have all achieved a significant amount early in life.
That's interesting. So I'm going to go home and get my kids to write down some goals.
Write down some goals.
Send your kids to leadership camp in
Yes,
Paris.
That's right. Paris and Normandy. Yes. All right. And Orlando and DC.
Yeah.
Yes.
Orlando, of course.
Yeah.
There should be roller coasters engaged when you're 14 and learning leadership, right?
Absolutely.
So you might as well just go to Orlando and get on a few coasters.
Absolutely. You mentioned when we were speaking just before the show about you've been involved in things outside the U.S., and you just touched on that a moment ago. How's that informed who you are as a leader?
Well, to go back to one of the very early leadership adages that kind of got hammered into me is 5 years from now, you'll be the same person except for the books you read, the people you meet, and the places you go. And I think travel, very intentional travel, is one of the greatest educators, not just of our own learnings, but of leadership development. To develop specifically now when we talk about where the world is so connected, and that it really is a global world where we have a global reality in a local level.
Did you say global?
I said global. I did global.
He did. We need to spell that out at the bottom of the screen.
It is
with a definition.
All right, Shakespeare.
Global. And so the problem with you being in here is we've been enough time together that every time he says something, I want to chase a rabbit to okay, Shakespeare. Because we were in a room earlier this week where we were using ChatGPT in a Shakespearean voice, which was an interesting few minutes for that. So, by the way, if you get an email from Brent, he committed to send every email for I think the next 30 days.
In Shakespearean.
In Shakespearean.
Nice.
For that. So, but when we talk about travel, spent significant time in East Asia, East Africa, North Africa, Europe, and each of those regions of the world have such a different flair and understanding. It shaped an understanding of cultural leadership, but also the way that God has fashioned the world. And we can be very myopic in our relational lens, in our decision-making lens, but to sit in a village with a Sudanese leader and talk about what does it mean for justice in a tribe in Sudan is different than what it looks like in East Asia with a very hierarchical family structure, and what it looks like in America in a very individualistic, exceptional culture. And so being able to understand how the different cultures translate, not from just a book knowledge, but having lived it and sat in those rooms has been significant in just my own journey.
That's cool. What were you doing in those countries?
If I tell you, I have to kill you. So, but
Brent has the same story.
So
Tell him.
In East Asia, spent a lot of time working in leadership development, primarily with college students. In East and North Africa, West Africa, I was doing economic and education and church development in most rural parts of those villages and refugee camps, and then spent a little bit of time in Europe doing leadership development with high school and college students.
So we talk about often how Anglo-centric or Western-centric a lot of things are. How did you experience the globalization of some of the leadership frameworks that we tend to use, and did that connect? Did it feel like out of place, out of context with being in a refugee camp in Sudan or wherever?
Yeah, I think the one thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is Anglo thought gets exported around the world, every aspect of it. And so the challenge that in an effort to oftentimes help villages, we've actually divorced their culture and how God has really shaped that part of the world and thrown our lens on top of it and said, this is the way it should be done. And so you have a tribal leader who's trying to lead a village who's illiterate, that doesn't really have an economy. They're trying to figure out what does it look like. And you may actually have someone who is a follower of Jesus in that community, and they're trying to figure out what does it look like to make disciples or build a church and help every aspect of it. And their only framework for that is what they've seen maybe on a television, or maybe from an Anglo leader from the 70s who came through and has gotten passed down from a couple of generations. And so you're almost having to undo some things that we've accidentally exported that didn't take into account where these people are at in the culture in which they live.
And what a great legacy to be leaving to the world, our exported TV and movies and
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh wow. We're very proud of that as a culture.
We run the rest of the planet. Good job.
How much
Yes. We have not done that well. It was in some aspects of that.
Well, right. So to me, it seems like a perfect opportunity for the things like a Christian or a kingdom-oriented leader would be saying, well, Jesus is our leader, and our model for leadership and servant leadership and things like that. So that goes against a lot of grain and practice anyways, especially when you see like a heroic leader, not necessarily a servant leader in launching, or maybe they are, but do you see that like the servant leadership framework ends up jiving more with other cultures than it does with the individualistic Western?
From my, and I have a very limited perspective, although I've spent a lot of time in these places. I find that the individual leaders who hold positions, when they begin to understand what a servant leadership model looks like and the possibilities of that to transform their community, they're more receptive.
Yeah.
Greater challenges, because it hasn't been modeled before. So you're going generations of this is what I've seen, but there's more of an openness and willingness to adopt and to try. And then typically they see greater fruit, when they start to shift the way they lead, because it is so unprecedented in the culture, whether that's, a family unit in East Asia or it is a tribe in East Africa. The other thing that you see in both those cultures, they're more servant-minded already. There is more of a togetherness and community approach to all of life. Great respects and great gaps in their hierarchies and their patriarchy, but there's a tenderness to serving each other that we don't necessarily have all the time.
My parents were missionaries in Mexico for about a decade, and Dad literally almost died. And the way the community there came around, even neighbors that really didn't know my parents, started serving in a way that blew most Americans' minds. Like, your neighbor dropped what they were doing and drove you to the store. Just from the littlest thing to somebody paying a taxi cab ride, to major things, coming and sitting with them in the hospital for weeks so Mom could have a break, because my sister was still younger at the time. So that was one thing that impressed me, that I was already an adult, but even the greater awareness of we as Americans have really missed the boat when it comes to community. Maybe we had it when our nation was founded, but our individualistic really culture here has created those bigger gaps, and we long for community, right? Whether you're involved in a church or a small group or in a secular setting. I mean, we're filming here and connected, and the whole purpose of this community here is to give smaller businesses a place to come together and support each other, business or just relationally or other reasons. So I'm not surprised to hear you say other nations are that way as much. Did you find other parts of the planet were more spiritually sensitive?
Oh, I would say that the United States is the least spiritually sensitive place I've spent a significant amount of time. And with maybe the only second to that would be London. And I would actually say London is kind of reverting into a revival of spiritual renewal, more so than the United States is. And so that's a great encouragement, because we typically trail them by a generation or so in our culture. But I think I grew up very conservative in my faith and walking with Jesus. The first time that I became aware of just what God was doing in some places was sitting in Indonesia, and individuals coming up and saying, I had a dream about this. I had a vision about staunch Muslim country. And then going to East Asia and hearing the same thing, and then going to North Africa and East Africa and watching miracles happen that I thought that can't be real. And then watching individuals go, no, that's all we have. And the receptivity to not just spiritual things, but to a supreme creator who is in control of all things, I find is much greater around the world than it is here.
Yeah, that was my experience in Africa. They're very much more alert to the spirit realm. So, change of subjects. What excites Brad? What are you passionate about? You used the term moonshot when we were talking before the show.
Yeah, I think one of the great discoveries in life is just having a glimpse. I don't think we ever get the full picture of why in the world am I here, and how has God uniquely gifted me, and what are my superpowers that I get to steward for His kingdom. And several years ago, kind of wrestled that. How would I phrase that? And really believe that God's put me here to architect moonshots that impact His kingdom. So I've spent the past 15 years really, and try to spend as much time as possible now, working with kingdom-minded, growth-oriented entrepreneurs who are either in starting things up or they're growing things, and helping them figure out what does it actually mean to steward all God's given them, to see dreams come reality. And so whether that's in the business sector, the nonprofit sector, or the church sector, love getting to sit and go, let's take that idea, see what God wants to do with it.
Would you, if you had to categorize the way you're wired, would you consider yourself more visionary or more on the execution side?
So I probably would lean a little bit more towards the execution side. I think that's one of the rare things. I've sat in the visionary seat and in the integrator seat, and feel a little ambidextrous in both of those. So that's one of those just unique things I feel like God's given me.
Which one do you think's more absent in the scenarios you've been introduced, the visionary or the execution?
Oh, it's almost 95% the execution. And so I think a lot of, and that's one of the reasons we work at Novum Partners, is to go, well, we've watched a lot of organizations and leaders have big ideas, and the inability or just the continual keeping my head above the water, we watch a lot of dreams and a lot of kingdom opportunities die. And so it's not intentional, but it does take some execution horsepower to see. We believe God breathes life into things and He opens doors, but also I think He gifts people to execute. And whether it's fear or constraints or whatever that is that keeps us from executing a lot of times, capacity. Love helping guys go, we've got to make this happen.
Thinking back about your education track, your PhD, and what you've seen in the real world, where has that been congruent, the research or the study that you did about change management, the learning that you did on the topic? Where do you see congruency in that in the real world? And then obviously we'll talk about where you don't see it.
I think the congruence in that space is really what it looks like to lead people through change, and from the research just bearing out why do things often fail. And I think a lot of that comes through, regardless of your leadership style, when you're running change management, you're shepherding people from the present to a future that they can't see. And Myers-Briggs and one of the global personality assessments did some research about 15 years ago and said about 73% of the population is present oriented, meaning it's not that they're afraid of the future, they just can't see it, and they're actually really okay with keeping things how they are. And so as long as we're okay today, we'll worry about tomorrow when it comes. And most visionary leaders are the opposite. Most visionary leaders, they don't actually know what's going on today. They're 10 years ahead.
Yeah.
And so that gap really creates a chasm. And saw that in the research, see it in real life. The chasm that has to be crossed from, you actually have to walk people through all 5 stages of grief as they separate from their present reality to begin to trust a new future. And the more a leader can bring both time and space and credibility to go, hey, we're going to take this and it is going to be hard, but what you're losing here, you can already see the fruit of what you gain in the future, allows that chasm to kind of shrink, the divide, if you will.
Right. And you can't just drop like this grief model in here and not dive into that just a little
I was
bit
going
more.
to say, we're going to put you on the spot now. You gave a quantity, 5 stages.
That's fantastic. Yeah, so walk us through that. Remind us what the 5 stages of grief are for those of us. I mean, some of our listeners may not remember what those 5 are.
I usually throw things out like that.
I have ChatGPT, so we can look it up.
Yeah, that's, we may have to, because you've now put me on the spot, but you're talking about really shock, the denial aspect, the anger aspect of it. Then there's the new life. There's a better phrase for that, but there's a possibility in the future. And the 5th one's slipping my mind. You might be able to call it off the top of your head. But you walk through that, and the reason you walk through that is because you are actually losing something. When you change, you are losing something. And the only reason you're willing to change is because letting go of what you're losing is less of an impact to you than what you're going to gain. And when you're talking about most of the world being present oriented, you've got to get through the future is going to be better for you. You see this more in the church world when change management really fails, because it's a volunteer organization. And so if in order for me to move, I'm not financially motivated, you actually have to go relationally, emotionally, spiritually. Leaving where we are is okay, because what you are personally going to gain is far greater than what you're going to lose. And then allowing people to wrestle with that.
It's fascinating because you don't have to change necessarily. I mean, although that's one of the first stages of organizational change, you have to create the urgency.
Right.
So you have to kill something, you burn the ships, you do something that somehow forces people to grieve. Otherwise, I'm not going to willingly go through grief in something that I still have. And
that's a great point. The research we bared out is the speed, the pace of change is determined by one single factor. And it is whatever group, your constituents that have to change, their perception of the crisis, not the reality of crisis, their perception of their crisis determines how quickly they're willing to change. So if an organization is losing $10 million, but I personally don't feel that, probably not going to change.
Right.
If you go, hey, you're not going to have a job next month. Okay, let's change. That's a personal crisis. I feel that. I can perceive the crisis. So it's the perception of crisis, not necessarily the reality of crisis, that allows people to grieve and start to go open their hands a little bit to change.
Well, so in thinking through that real quick, I mean, if I may not have a job in a month, is it an easier change for me to leave this and go find another job and me not be part of the change? Or to your point earlier of I have to see that it's better for me to stay here and be part of this change and pay that price. And so that's, I guess, large reason why organizational change is so difficult and has such a low success rate. easier to kill something than it is to change it.
Well, and part of this is in our we talked about the individualization of our culture is it's not this is beneficial for the whole community or our whole team.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have to feel the personal benefit of change.
Mm-hmm.
I was just making the connection because it's been said it's easier to kill an organization than it is to change it, but you're saying really you have to kill it either way. You have to kill the organization even if you keep the name and keep the people and keep the incorporated thing, but you really have to kill it and grieve it, move in and just commit that you're moving into whatever this new entity kind of rebirthing is.
Well, and it's not, you may kill part of it, or you may kill, sometimes you're not killing the whole thing, but something's dying.
Something's dying, right.
And the more you're willing to embrace that and go, hey, something is going to die here, the people who are changing are going to lose something. Mm-hmm. Let's name that and give them the opportunity to process that.
And just to give a practical example, and then you could share a few of your own. I was involved in a lot of IT projects in the 90s and early 2000s. And we even had to kill the old system, literally take it offline at some point. So there was a predetermined date. As of this date, the old system is no longer available. If we didn't do that, people would continue to rely on the old system the old ways, look for the data in the old system, try to go back and pull the reforms from the old system, everything from the old system. So if we didn't announce this is the day it dies, then there was motivation to, well, I got to learn the new system before the old system, and then there'd always be the diehard, well, not always, but often somebody would say, well, we got to keep the old system alive for tax return purposes or whatever. Okay, fine, you can have a terminal, we're putting it in the closet behind a padlock, with a generator. You got to crank the crank to get it to work, like make it extremely difficult to use the old system. But for the general public, we killed it. And so I hadn't thought of it in that term before. But where else, like some practical examples, have you seen, like not kill the whole organization, but maybe a department, a team, a system?
Yeah, I think this is easily seen in system development, and whether that's management systems, financial systems, et cetera. Typically, in every season of a company, an organization, where are we at, and what does it look like for us to grow, be sustainable, and be resilient in the headwinds? And typically, in every life stage of an organization, you actually have to break down every single system and rebuild it. And so not all at once, never do that. You will kill the organization. But you are going to have to go, okay, what we were as a small organization, how we made decisions, how we marketed, how we grew our revenue, how we executed was incredible. We're now a large organization with 7 or 8 layers to it. We now have to have new information systems, new management systems. And then when we begin to scale and go, okay, we're either a national or global organization, it's going to require new systems. Meaning every time you bring in a new system and something has to die or be reclassified or reframed. I think what I see often, and you kind of allude to it, is the very dangerous spot for most people is where they try to go, we're going to appease or we're going to try to compromise and we're going to keep both things alive. And both of them end up killing each other. Mm-hmm. Or what you do is we live at 50% of the capacity of what either one of them could have been. Mm-hmm. And so unfortunately I see that a lot in every sector, where we go, we're going to try to do both. Well, that doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And you either have to commit to go, this is not the right time for us to make this change, or we're going to make this change and we're going to weather the storm, knowing that somebody's going to get upset. Things are not going to go perfect, but the fruit of making that decision and change now will pay dividends in the future for that. So I was just thinking about, 2 different organizations, both of them very similar tracks. One's fast growing, exponential growth over the past really 7 years, 25-40%. They're about to stage to hit a couple multiples here the next 2 or 3 years. And they literally looked at their team and said, we've run really hard the past 7 years. Everybody's been working. And we're going to spend the next year and a half getting everything ready to scale. Things are going to be different. They've actually already started the grieving process with their team to go, we're going to do some things that are a little different. and they've set a date, a window actually of in between 9 and 18 months to go in this period. We're going to flip some switches, and it's going to be rough. We know it's going to be rough, so bear with us. We're going to get through it, and the impact that we're going to make on the other side of it, both for you personally, but also, well, our mission, is going to be well worth it. Mm-hmm. But just get right. And so that's an organization I think has done really well. Another organization I'd say is very kind of done the opposite of, hey, we think we may change. Mm-hmm. One day, we're gonna change. Let's talk about it, and talk about it a lot. And they actually never commit to that window of, this is what it looks like for us to change, and this is where we're going to step forward. So they're kind of in no man's land.
Talk about the weight of communication in the change management process.
Well, distance between what has been said, typically the leader, and those being actually changed and moved through change, the greater that distance is, the only thing that fills that is a lack of trust, right? When we have gaps in our vision, our conversations, our availability, and trying to change people, trust does not automatically fill that gap. Now, we as leaders always say, hey, trust me, fill the gap. But the people who are following us are saying, hey, give us a reason to trust you. And if you don't have decades of credibility, they're going, this feels really risky. Why should we trust you? Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a great example, and I've watched a lot of a couple of pastors, a couple of business leaders do this really well. When you're going through change management, the communication piece of, this is where we're headed. We're not 20 years from now, but over the next 2 years, this is what I expect you will feel. I actually think you're gonna be shocked by it. There's probably gonna be a moment where you're gonna wanna like cut my head off. I get it. All right. Here's what I promise. I'm gonna continually walk you through this. I'm gonna continue to say, this is where we're gonna provide value. We're gonna watch after your health, the culture of our organization, and we're gonna continue to press into that. The more they communicate that on a regular basis, and the transparency of when things aren't going well, just telling people, hey, we're behind. Everybody feels it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Just go ahead and tell them. Like, go ahead and say, I recognize this is not as planned. Here's how we're getting back on course. This will be the adaptations we're making to the change management plan. That type of communication allows the organization to actually build credibility in the middle of the headwinds. Mm-hmm. And I don't see change management, unless you're hiring new staff and firing everybody else, going really well without that. So I think you really reduce the turnover and the cultural issues.
What's the frequency? Daily, weekly, monthly?
I think anytime you're doing change management, you're driving with 2 feet. I use that analogy to go, you kind of have to have the gas pedal and the brake. And sometimes in change management, that is going to be weekly. There are times that actually be multiple times during the day. And there are also times where you're going to go, hey, our next update is going to be a month. Here's everything that's going on in a month. And we're going to circle back up and let you know what's going on in a month. But stay tuned. Mm-hmm. And so I think as the leader, that's part of, I think you have to put your shepherd hat on and go, what does actually our people that we're leading, our company, our team, our constituents, what do they need right now to continue to grow healthy in this process?
I think there's lots of ways to communicate as well, and I think some of the pitfalls I've seen with leadership is one of the main ways that we communicate is with our scoreboards, our scorecards, and our dashboards. And so sometimes we vision a change, but then we leave the current scorecard in place, and so they get mixed messages, right? And that may not be the top leaders thing, but maybe the middle leaders haven't grasp what the change is all about in the communication. So I talked a little bit about the different forms of communication, not just my email or my 10 minutes at a staff meeting or something like that.
I think the biggest opportunity in every organization in change management and the greatest risk are middle managers. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who actually carry the water, to go to an analogy of like, they're the ones who actually have to communicate up and down. And when you walk through change management, Your middle managers will accidentally sabotage, intentionally sabotage, or actually be the reason that people go, okay, we'll trust the leader because you're trusting the leader. I trust you. You're close to the action in my world. And so you were talking a little bit about that aspect of the scorecard. In organizations, the middle manager is the only one that influences up and down. Mm-hmm. And so everybody else is either up or down. Mm-hmm. And so when you walk through this, communicating and making sure there's clarity, that's the biggest thing about communication. Everybody talks about communication. Really, it's clarity. Just be clear with me. Let me know where things are at, where we're headed. And if you'll speak truthfully and clear to me, okay, we can work with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's some of the management circles I run in, they say you've not effectively communicated until you've communicated the same thing 7 times. Could you
say that again, please?
Does your research bear that to be true?
That was not necessarily in the scope of research, but I find that's not only true, but I think it's communicating in multiple ways, multiple times. And I had a great leader one time get in the car, and I love these questions when they're like, hey, what does it mean to communicate? Like, I don't know, tell people something. And so he was giving me this quiz. I was driving him to the airport, and he said, no, to communicate means you actually get in the boat with somebody and you row in the same direction. And you haven't communicated until they're helping you row and they're rowing in the same direction. And there's no science to that. That was just his philosophy. But that definition of communication has always stuck in my mind of, until people are willing to get in the boat and row in the same direction with me, they either don't trust me, I haven't communicated enough, or they don't quite understand where we're actually headed.
Or they do understand, they're not interested.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. I think an often underutilized version of a form of communication is the sermon prayer. So the sermon prayer, where you're bringing conviction and teaching a principle through a prayer, right? And you're trying to correct people and tell them what they should be doing. It's right next door to the
Parents
gossip.
use that a lot.
Well, there's the gossip prayer as well,
Right.
where we're trying to spread gossip through prayer requests. But then the sermon prayer is where you can kind of pray over your organization and kind of, please God, help the people who are stuck in their old ways, to, find their way or find their way out, things like that. Thank you, Jesus, for helping us with that. So that would be communication.
That's a unique tool in the tool belt.
Yeah, especially for Christian leaders.
Absolutely.
It'd be kind of weird for an atheist.
It's how Jesus led. Well, yeah. I got to listen to you lecture earlier this week here at Connected, and I'd love to take advantage of you being on mic right now to share. There's, I think, a framework that came out of your research, or I don't know if it was something that was derived from your research, but there was the 5 stages of organizations, and I think it was fascinating. So I'd love for you to maybe spend some time just walking us through that a little bit.
I'd love to. So part of what we began to realize was that there are life stages for every organization, regardless of sector, regardless of mission, that every organization walks through experiences. And we use numbers. So a level one organization operates in survival mode. And that is we've got a vision and an idea, and we're hoping to get traction. And I think there's a great parallel in the scripture. Yeah, like just stay alive, keep grinding. The hope for a better day is what keeps us going. The passage of scripture that reminds me of is really the Israelites in Exodus. They had the promise of Abraham and God's covenant with them, but things were not looking up. So it was make bricks and hope for a better day. And the second phase we actually call a transition zone, because about 90% of entities in the U.S. live in survival mode, level 1 organizations. The transition zone you can be in for a few months to about 1.5 years, 2 years, but you can't live in it. And the transition zone is really, it's a battle to move from level 1 to level 3. And in a level 3 organization, that's a growth-oriented organization where all of a sudden the wind's at our back. We've got traction in our flywheel. We feel like things are moving. But to get there, you have to walk through level 2. And that transition zone is usually catalyzed by a crisis, whether that's we're not sure how we're going to survive, things didn't go as planned. And at that moment, there's typically new or outside capital, both whether it's relational, financial, intellectual capital that helps you move from 1 to 3 and kind of cross over the transition zone. If you follow the Exodus account, it's really that moment where the Israelites are a 3 days journey outside of Egypt, and they're in between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea, and Moses is sort of like, what do we do? And the Israelites are thinking, you brought us out here to kill us. We're all going to die right here. And God, if you look at God in this aspect, as outside or new capital, new to the equation, if you will, for them. And he tells Moses to open up his arms and spread out his arms, and the waters part, and they cross on dry land. At that moment, that crisis actually forms the credibility that Moses needs and the people of Israel need together. They share that moment to go, we can get to the other side, and like, this is going to be okay. And then the level 3 organization, when you move from the transition zone, is all about how do we grow, how do we continue to add, how do we continue to maximize what we have in place. But the systems that you have at level 1 have to completely change in level 3. And so what sustains you at level 3 are really optimized systems to manage not just ideas and people, but now manage systems of people. And so we talk about kind of the optimization zone of organizational life, where we're continuing to tweak, manage, and continue to grow. And then the second transition zone, and again, less than about 9.6% of organizations live in level 3 in the U.S. The second transition zone of a level 4 is really moving from growth to an exponential organization. And at that moment, what it really takes is a lot of growth from, through the level 3 to go, okay, we want to go and very innovative, design what the future looks like. We want to be disruptive, and we want to go from a central command organization to we have a central core, but we are an agile edge organization where our information and the decisions we make are actually coming from the edges of the organization, not from the central part of the corporation. And so when we move to level 4, it's this kind of moment of, are we willing to break down everything that we've just built, risk some of the growth to take our impact, whether that's financial, missional, whatever, however you define impact, to become an exponential organization. And so you can't live in level 4. It's a transition zone. Mm-hmm. And the great passage of scripture that I think is when the Israelites come to the Jordan River, and they do it twice. The first time Moses brings them, and if you remember, he sends 12 spies out, and 10 of them come back and go, the other side's too scary, it's too daunting, the walls are too big, they're giants. 2 come back, Joshua and Caleb, and go, hey, God's given us, he's called us that, let's go. And the nation of Israel ends up spending 40 more years in the desert, right? A generation dies off before they cross the Jordan River. And it's actually Joshua, and Moses dies, and Joshua leads the nation of Israel across the Jordan River. So we equate that crossing the Jordan River to a level 5 organization. And so when you get to a level 5 organization, there are 3 primary things that have to be true. Your credibility has to match the size of your vision. So if people don't know you and they don't trust you, you can't grow exponentially. You have to have a shared vision. And when we say a shared vision, that now means the leaders that are associated with the organization are now acting like owners and going, I know how to make decisions based on our intent and based on where we're headed. The great, that's Caleb, the elder who goes, hey, that's my mountain. I'm going to take the mountain. I don't need your permission. I'm just telling you I'm going to take the mountain. And Joshua goes, okay, that's your mountain. Go take it. And so that's really the picture of an exponential organization as it moves. The third piece of that is it has to be an empowering organization. And a lot of times we use the term empowerment. But really what we mean is we've given people a really long leash. Empowerment goes, you know where we're headed. You have all the authority, all of the tools you need. Let me know how I can help. Mm-hmm. Right? And so full empowerment, that space. And as long as you're playing within the vision and the values and hitting the metrics that we've agreed upon, go take land. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And less than 1% of organizations in the U.S. actually get to be a level 5. Whether that's you look at a financial piece on a J curve, or you're looking at a nonprofit who's scaled their impact. And we would define an exponential organization where the resources we input are now generating a multiple on the output than where we were as a growing organization.
Big grapes.
Big grapes.
As you were talking through, I'd never really thought of this before, but if you had an organization, one of the really cool things that comes out as they were moving into the promised land was there were lots of mountains to take, and there was like, okay, I'll help you take your mountain. And once a group had their mountain, they still left their mountain and went and helped others take it. So there's this really cool, we've got multiple mountains to take, so there's some diversity of like product or mission or market or things. Yet there was not a siloed approach. It was more
Very synergistic in how
very
we do it.
synergistic. That's fascinating, and demonstrates a really mature type of organization and not quite so scarcity minded. Like if I hope you take your mountain, that means I lose mine. Like that type of mindset doesn't survive in a level 5.
In fact, if I remember the story correctly, Caleb had helped everybody else.
He does.
And then he's like, okay, now it's my turn. And I'm going to take the hardest one with the biggest giants. So,
And as you shared all that, what I found is that most organizations fail to reach level 5 for 2 things, and that's really a fear of loss of control, and that's on the leader. What am I going to lose? Because in order to do that, I'm no longer the head honcho.
I'm not the guy.
I'm not the guy. And the second of what you just said is, I can't control a level 5 organization. In the fact of something just fearing my position being lost, but in this, I don't know where it's going to go. And when we cross over to a level 5, we're kind of igniting the rockets. And it's a great Toy Story line from like 20 years ago, and Buzz and Woody are kind of at the end of Toy Story 1, and Buzz has a rocket on his back, and they're like, "Hey, we're flying," and they're like, "Wait, rockets explode, right? They're dangerous. They can be awesome, but they also blow things up." And to move to a level 5 organization, you are risking that. Just going, not that you'd blow the organization up, but you're going, we don't exactly know where the innovation will take us as we become a learning organization from the edges. So it's a fascinating study in that aspect.
Would you, and I imagine the data didn't bear this out, but would you hypothesize that it's or how important is it for a leader to have an awareness of all 5 levels as they're in level 1? Like, or if are you less likely to succeed if you don't know that there's a level 5 out there, or even that you're trying to build that in while you're in the same level?
That would be an interesting look at of just going the awareness of. I do think it.
Because it's not just a matter of surviving to get to 5.
No.
Right, because you can survive at level 1.
which is where most
generations.
places stay.
Right, we stay there and we survive there, we never leave it. So it's not just a matter, can I survive long enough to get to level 5? There's a journey to be made, right?
Very much so. And I do think it is important to clarify where you intend to head. And I don't think every company should go to level 5. Most organizations and companies are not built for level 5. That's okay. Like we're going to be a level 3 organization. Here's what it means for us to be fully integrated as a level 3 organization, and we want to have great financial returns. We want to have great culture. We want to make a great kingdom impact as level 3. Awesome. I do think you move from level 1. Moving from level 1 to level 3 is the reality of we are going to want to make an organized effort and contribution to the world.
Well, so is there a minimum size to like a level 5 and 3? Like, can you be a small business and be in that level 5?
Can you be a solopreneur with level 3?
I haven't researched that. I would argue that it'd be very difficult to be a solopreneur at level 3,
Right.
Because at that point, you haven't built a growing company, right? You may have a business that's generating great revenue and great returns, but at that point, you're not managing systems of people to maximize.
No, unless you've gotten good at collaboration and have somehow built great collaborative partnerships, that you've got an effective organization that's not a traditional corporation in a legal sense, but you're still operating in a scaled way with groups and things, and that's maybe even harder to do. And maybe that in some sense in the volunteer type organizations, that's probably a huge challenge because you don't have the normal attachments that you have in a business with paychecks and
Right.
and contracts and things like that. You've got volunteers that are much more loosely connected into this thing. So how do you take an organization like that to
Yes.
where people are, they can leave at any moment, and you can't motivate them with paychecks or threaten them with performance evaluations.
But I think that actually has there's some definite pros to that.
Okay.
Right? Because I'm not constrained to the typical models. I've actually had to trust my people
It
more.
forces you more in level 5.
Yeah, and they've had to trust me more, and I've had to trust. I've got, at least my experience in nonprofits and church circles is you've got to communicate more than in some work circles, some secular circles. You're relying on relationship capital. Those volunteers want to come out. They feel part of the mission. They feel more empowered than they even do at work. They may have keys to the whole campus, and at work they don't have a key to their own door because it's they sit in a cubicle. And so I'm just curious, any thoughts along those lines of?
Oh, I would agree with what you two gentlemen just said. Of you're motivating people beyond a base level of my basic needs are met. So a paycheck. I've got position. I've got some comfort, security financially. But when you're in a volunteer organization, you are having to lean higher into something, encouraging people for their life to matter more for something, and you have to think creatively in how to steward their resources and how to maximize gifts with a low budget. That, I think, allows for people to have greater buy-in, but it also makes change management more fragile. Because you need those people not just to be apathetic. So a company can still change if I just show up and have a few off weeks. You're leading a volunteer organization, and the guy who opens the building has a few off weeks. Well, you're in trouble. In a church, the sound guy has a few off weeks. Everybody feels
Or a
it.
lot of off weeks.
Right, or a lot of off weeks. So he feels it. So
Shouldn't be the sound guy.
No, shouldn't be the sound. So I think it becomes riskier for change management. But I think the ability to shepherd and to steward those people, because typically you're talking about an intrinsic vision, whether you're touching beyond their basic needs, but to their heart needs, desires for meaning, for purpose. It allows them to start moving and stewarding in those directions, especially if you have the credibility and doesn't, Winston Churchill is at least given credit for the quote of never waste a crisis, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that's true anytime you're changing, specifically in volunteer organizations.
Do you think, since we got off on the nonprofit world, do you think they tend to have, not all, but they're a greater share of this ability to think like level 5? Because there's more empowerment, there's more trust, there's in a healthy, we've all seen unhealthy nonprofits, but in a healthy, there tends to be a lot of trust, a lot of empowerment, a lot of less rules because they're volunteers, right? So feels like less constraints.
I think the one challenge for that, I don't think there are external constraints. I think there are internal constraints. And you were talking about a scarcity mindset earlier. I think oftentimes in nonprofit, whether that's the church or a typical nonprofit organization, a scarcity mindset plagues the leadership of the organization, which actually makes it harder to shift the organization than if you were facing external pressures. Because external pressures I can name. A scarcity mindset puts blinders on what I think is possible.
I've observed things before, like when you're in startup mode, whether it be in a nonprofit or a company, when you got nothing to lose, there's often, I've got nothing to lose, so I'll let go of control, right? Because there's nothing to control anyways.
Right.
And then as it hits a certain mass, a certain size, well, now this responsibility steps in that I've got to actually move in a protector instead of a leader, and I have to protect the things, which means I reach for controls. Like protection tends to be more of a control thing, and I've my own observation, not a ton of data points, but it'd be a fascinating study to see how the size of the organization correlates to the amount of control. But I can imagine as you get into trying to move in a level 5 organization, which has gone back up the other side of the valley where I really have no more control, just because it's the maturity and the mass of it, that as a leader I've had to go through that valley of I've got to protect this thing. I'm the hero. I've got this thing on my back, which means I'm controlling. I'm pulling levers, and I'm leading this thing, and that often ends up constricting this thing, keeping it in that level 1 or level 3 wherever they happen to be on that.
Well, and as you said that, I think probably the best analogy I've seen from a framework or mindset from level 3 to level 5 is I'm a big Apple user, so I think Apple iOS is the best software out there, but it would be moving from an Android Microsoft framework switching to a Apple iOS framework or software. It's that significant of a shift. And the reason I say that, just to piggyback off what you just said, is once I learn level 3 thinking, how I control this, it actually, there's a value that I breathe in of, they need me to pull these levers. I need to do this. The organization will only grow if I do these things. It actually creates a box where I'm unwilling to unlearn and learn something else. Yeah. And so it creates this kind of operating system where rarely do I see a leader go, we ran through level 3 and I changed my own personal operating system to get us to level 5.
Yeah.
It's very rare that they would somebody go in and go, we built this thing, and I was willing to unlearn and relearn what it means to be an exponential organization.
Brad, let's go there as we wrap up. Talk to somebody that realizes they're level 3, they desire to or realize they've got to go to level 5. What are some of the things they need to wrestle with, consider, read up on, go get educated on, reassess? What are those? What's that 1, 2, 3 things you would look at that level 3 leader and say, if you want to go to level 5, here's 3 things you got to get straight.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is be very clear on your individual purpose as a leader, because it is ruthless and it is difficult to walk through those transition zones. And don't make a shift from level 3 to level 5 just to become a level 5 organization. Have an internal intrinsic calling. Go, we need to do this because of market. We need to do this because of opportunity. We need to do this because of impact. And we have a very clear picture of what we want that to be. And then do the internal wrestling with what needs to be different about me. Because there will be things that have to be different. There'll be things that have to be different about my leadership team. Not just individuals, but what are the skill sets? What are the thinking models that we need to wrestle with to become that? Mm-hmm. And then the third piece, you talk about reading up. I think one of the great level 5 organizations in the world is Bible Study Fellowship. It's actually if you think about credibility, shared vision, and empowerment, I would study edge fringe organizations that have global impact, not just we built something and we had a J curve because we were backed by $500 million investment, but the fact that, okay, there was something that actually went to the edges, and what is it that as they went to the edges that was actually repeatable throughout their entire process that allowed them to go into villages in Africa, closed countries, and San Antonio. Mm-hmm. What made it effective? Because it's the same type thinking and models of being repeatable and consistent from a Bible study fellowship. I mean, you can study the social media channels that hit a J curve pretty quickly. But go, what are the repeatable things that they did really well? And then what is that for my organization? Mm-hmm. Because if you can't get it simple and repeatable, mm-hmm. level 5 is almost impossible.
Most people I've talked to assume level 5 is more complex. I suspect somebody like Bible Study Fellowship actually has much leaner, more simplistic processes. That'd be my guess. You have any thoughts on that? I
think complexity allows for simplicity. And so I don't think you'll ever find an end user experiencing something that's simple, that is not supported by great complexity. And so let's just talk about the financial backside of an organization like BSF. You're now talking about global accounting, where you're receiving funds and distributing funds in countries around the world, and then you're also having to calculate what does it look like to get this in multiple languages on time, in base, and culturally relevant. Oh yeah, and by the same, we have 60 different codes that we're having to follow based on governmental laws, right? So no different than a global company in that aspect. But the end user, it's very simple.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Bible study leader, core set of rules, right? Mm-hmm. Playbook. And I show up, I do my homework, I'm meeting community group, and I'm growing God's word. So the end result of a lot of complexity in their home office allows for the end user to experience something that's very simple. And so I don't think level 5 organizations can be complex for the end user. They have to get through the complexity on the backside and get simple for the end user on the front side of it.
Including their frontline employees, their mid-level managers. Life's got to get somewhat less complex.
Because to become level 5, I need to be able to operate our core process in light of our vision without someone telling me this is what you need to do. Mm-hmm. I need to be a man. I need the ability to be a man on an island, experience a set of circumstances, and know this is the decision we should make as an organization.
Mm-hmm. It's probably simplicity of vision, and the objective is very simple, which allows for the individuality and the complex implementations in the different in the different spaces. So that's like a key I'm pulling out of that. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, to get to that level 5 where you are scaling, where things are happening, it's very clear what needs to happen, yet very free and how to make that happen where you're at, and you're empowered to do that in the way that you need to.
Biggest corporation on the planet that I know of is Walmart. Their employee manual is one of the smallest ones I've ever seen. I've gone into mom and pop shops whose employee manual was 5 times the size, and they had 8 employees. But you go to Walmart, and their employee manual's literally like that thick, if even that thick. Lots of white space.
Yeah, you talk about Walmart. I had the privilege of walking really close with the Coca-Cola company, bottling company for a while. So arguably one of the 3 most recognizable brands in the world.
Yeah.
I've never been in any village in the world where I could not get a Coke within 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And it was a very simple. Mm-hmm. They knew where the bottler was. Go get it, sell the Coke, bring the bottle back, fill it back up. Just keep getting, and they had obviously they're a very complex organization. We get to the complexity of that. But at the end of the day, it was find somebody who has transportation, who knows how to sell it, sell the Cokes. We can get in every village in the world. Mm-hmm. So it's fascinating when you start talking about the level 5, large organizations, large corporations, extreme complexity.
What's the smallest level 5 company you've personally come across? Like in revenue or people headcount?
You know, the smallest are churches. And it's very rare for a church to be level 5. Very, very rare. But typically that would be 30 to 35 people. And because they are an exponential organization, there has to be exponential growth in that aspect. And so there's a gentleman that I've had a privilege of getting to learn from outside California that has started. He has been credited with 4,000 churches coming from his church of 35. Mm-hmm. Because he figured out the simple model of discipleship, leadership development, evangelism, start new churches. Discipleship, leadership development, and he knew he couldn't control it. Mm-hmm. So he created some governing pieces of it, set it free.
Cool.
Yeah. So, well, Joel, thanks for taking time to sit down with Dr. Fessler. And, man, you two gentlemen are 2 of the best.
Well, it's good to get to know you a little bit better. I've only briefly seen you in the hallways a few times.
Well, it's good to be here.
So I was looking forward to spending the time with you.
Well, thanks for making that happen.
Yeah, thank you.